My sister moved into our mother's house the morning after the funeral, before the flowers on the grave had even settled. By Thursday, she'd changed the locks. By Friday, she'd texted the whole family a photo of the porch. The house was finally hers. Nobody knew that 3 years earlier, in a lawyer's office with a pen shaking in my hand, our mother had quietly put the deed in my name. Before I go further, if someone's ever tried to take something that was never theirs, hit like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. My name is Eleanor Voss, and I've never once trusted a summary. I'm an accountant, 34 years old, and not the kind who does taxes in a strip mall in April and disappears the rest of the year. I'm the kind who gets called in when a business needs someone to sit for 3 weeks, going backward through 4 years of records, looking for the one transaction that doesn't add up. I'm good at it. I'm good at it because I never trust a summary. I go to the source document every single time, no matter how many people tell me the summary is close enough. No matter how many times a client sighs and asks if I really need the original invoice when the spreadsheet already says what it says. My mother, Margaret Voss, used to tell people I'd been like that since I was 9 years old, sitting on the kitchen floor recounting my Halloween candy 3 separate times because my brother swore up and down he hadn't touched it. She wasn't wrong. She was rarely wrong about either of her daughters, which is part of what made everything that came later so hard to sit with. 3 years ago, on a gray Tuesday in September, my mother was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. I was 31 years old at the time, living 40 minutes away in a 1-bedroom apartment I actually liked, dating a man named Peter I actually liked, building the kind of quiet, unremarkable adult life you don't think to be grateful for until the day it's gone. My sister, Renee, is 4 years older than me, 38 now, and she was living 2 states away in Charlotte with her husband, running what she called, without a hint of irony, a life that couldn't just be paused for this. So I was the one who paused mine. I gave 60 days notice on my apartment. I told Peter, as gently as I could, that I didn't know how long this was going to take, and he told me, just as gently, that he understood, though I think we both knew that was the beginning of the end of us, and it was. I moved back into my childhood bedroom on Birchwood Lane, the one with the water stain on the ceiling shaped like the state of Florida, and for the next 14 months, I became my mother's ride to chemotherapy every other Tuesday, the hand she held during 4-hour infusions, the person who learned to read the fine print on 17 different medication interactions because nobody else in this family was going to bother. Renee visited 4 times in those 14 months. 4 times. In over 400 days. She called it not being able to handle seeing Mom like that. Said in a tone that expected sympathy rather than a follow-up question. I never said what I actually thought, which was that none of us could handle watching our mother disappear 1 pound and 1 bad lab result at a time. Some of us just showed up anyway because that's what showing up means. My mother never once asked me to give up my apartment, my relationship, or the 11 years I'd spent building a reputation as someone clients trusted with numbers that mattered. I offered. She let me, the particular way a person lets you do something for them once they've stopped having the energy left to argue about whether you should. 2 years into her treatment, on a rainy Tuesday morning in March, in a voice that had gone thin and careful the way voices do after too many rounds of chemo, she asked me to drive her somewhere, and to not tell your sister yet. The building was a small law office above a dry cleaner on Route 9, the kind of place with a receptionist named Carol who had clearly worked there since the carpet was new, since before either of us was born, probably. My mother didn't explain anything in the car. She just sat with her hands folded in her lap, the faint outline of her chemo port still visible under the collar of her cardigan, staring out the window like she was rehearsing a sentence she hadn't decided how to say yet. Inside, a lawyer named Mr. Halloran, a heavy-set man in his 60s with reading glasses perched halfway down his nose, laid 3 documents flat on the desk between us. A revised will, a durable power of attorney, naming me, and a quitclaim deed, transferring the house at 214 Birchwood Lane, the only house I had ever called home, the house with the ice cream can by the door and the rose bushes in the side yard. out of my mother's name and into mine. Effective immediately, not upon her death. Immediately, recorded and binding the moment the paperwork was filed. I remember asking her why, my voice cracking on that one word, because some part of me already understood what she was telling me without her having to say it out loud. My mother's answer, when it finally came, was 6 words. "I've watched this happen before." She never explained what she meant by that. I asked. Twice, gently, and both times she changed the subject, once to the weather, once to whether I'd remembered to feed the cat, and I let it go because you learn. Caring for someone with a terminal diagnosis, which questions are worth the energy it costs them to avoid answering. I signed everything Mr. Halloran put in front of me that day. I filed the deed exactly the way he instructed, in person, at the county clerk's office 2 towns over, paid the recording fee of $41 myself, and watched a clerk named Denise stamp it, date it, and enter it into the public record on the 14th of March, 3 years and 5 months, almost to the day before my mother would die. Then my mother made me promise something, holding both my hands in hers the way she used to when I was small and scared of a thunderstorm. "Don't tell your sister." Not because I want to hide anything from her, Ellie. Because if she knows now, she'll spend whatever time I have left fighting about it instead of just being here with me. I kept that promise for 3 years, 5 months, and 11 days. I have never once regretted it, not even knowing everything that came after, though I have replayed that 6-word sentence. I've watched this happen before, more times than I can count, trying to figure out exactly what my mother had lived through that made her so certain she needed to protect this one thing before she lost the strength to protect anything else. My mother died on a Sunday morning in October, 4 minutes after 7 o'clock, with my hand resting on her forearm and a hospice nurse named Priya quietly checking a monitor that had already stopped mattering by the time she checked it. She was 66 years old. She had taught 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary for 26 years. Retiring only when the treatments made standing in front of a classroom for 6 hours a physical impossibility. Renee arrived at the funeral home 2 days later, wearing a black dress with a designer label I recognized immediately, because I had once, in an unrelated case for a different client, priced out that exact same dress while disputing a company credit card statement. She cried loudly at the viewing, the specific kind of crying that pauses every few seconds to check who's watching. I'm not proud of noticing that, and I've told myself 100 times since that I have no right to grade another person's grief. But I also can't unhear what she said to our Aunt Patricia in the funeral home parking lot 20 minutes later, believing I was still inside finishing paperwork with the director. "At least this part's over now. We can finally figure out the house." I was standing in the doorway at that exact moment, holding a folder of documents I'd just finished initialing, and I said nothing. I told myself it was grief talking, that people say strange, ugly things in the raw first hours of loss, and shouldn't be held to them forever. I no longer believed that. The funeral itself was on a Wednesday, at 11 in the morning, and 41 people came despite the rain. 11 of them were former students of my mother's, now grown adults with children of their own, standing in the back row crying harder than some of our own blood relatives. I gave the eulogy. I did not mention the deed. I did not mention the promise. I talked instead about a woman who kept a coffee can full of exact change quarters by the front door for 20 years, specifically so that no child on Birchwood Lane would ever have to walk away from the ice cream truck a few cents short, and I meant every word of it, and I still mean it now, months later, standing in the same kitchen where that coffee can used to sit. The locksmith's van was parked in the driveway of 214 Birchwood Lane before 10 o'clock the next morning. I know the exact time, because our neighbor, Dolores, who has lived directly across the street since 1994 and misses absolutely nothing that happens on this block, sent me a photo of it at 9:52 with the caption, "Is this supposed to be happening?" I drove over within the hour. Renee was standing on the front lawn directing 2 movers as they carried a leather sofa I didn't recognize through the front door of a house she did not. in any legal sense, own. When I asked her what exactly she was doing, she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as pity. The specific practiced pity people reserve for someone they've already decided simply doesn't understand the situation. Mom always said this would come to me eventually. I'm just handling it now instead of waiting around. I asked her what she meant by always said. She couldn't produce anything more specific than a feeling. A vague childhood memory, a sense she claimed to have carried since she was maybe 12 years old, that the house would someday be hers because she was the older daughter. There was no document behind that feeling. There was no witness to any promise. There was only a locksmith's invoice for $420, taped to the refrigerator like a receipt of ownership, and a group text sent that same afternoon to 19 family members with a photo of the front porch and the caption, "Home again. Grateful every single day for this place." My cousin Marcus called me within the hour, confused, asking carefully if Renee and I had worked something out regarding the house. I told him the truth. There was nothing to work out, because the ownership of that house had never actually been in question, not for 3 years and 5 months. I didn't say more than that. I wanted to see exactly how far this would go before I had to use the one document that would end it in a single afternoon. What I did not know yet, and would not know for another 12 days, was that Renee had already met twice with a realtor, and that a for sale sign, still unassembled, was sitting folded in the trunk of her car the entire time she stood on that lawn, telling me our mother had always meant for this to be hers. For 12 days I let it play out. Not because I enjoyed watching it unfold, but because 11 years in this profession teaches you that the worst possible move with any financial discrepancy is to confront it before you've traced every branch of where the money, or in this case the house, has actually gone. I drove to the county recorder's office on a Tuesday morning, alone, and pulled the deed myself, just to be completely certain 3 years hadn't quietly changed anything I wasn't aware of. It hadn't. Document number 2023-20341D. Recorded March 14th. Grantor Margaret Voss. Grantee Eleanor Voss. Notarized. Stamped. Entirely unambiguous. I sat in my car in that parking lot afterward and read it 4 separate times, the exact way I'd once read a falsified invoice for a client last year. The one that had cost his small manufacturing company $62,000 before anyone bothered to check the source document instead of trusting the summary someone had typed up. Then Dolores called me again. She'd watched Renee that same morning, walking the yard with a man in a gray blazer, clipboard in hand, gesturing at the roofline the way appraisers and realtors do when they're pricing a listing. I drove over that same afternoon and found a business card wedged into the porch railing. Sandra Krieg, Coastal Realty Partners, direct line printed in bold beneath her name. I called her from my car before I'd even pulled out of the driveway. Sandra was pleasant, professional, and had absolutely no idea that the woman who had hired her to list 214 Birchwood Lane at $685,000 did not hold clear legal title to a single square foot of that property. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I was the legal owner of record and that I would be emailing her the recorded deed within the hour. There was a long pause on the line. Then she said, quietly, almost to herself, she told me her mother left it to her outright. She showed me a printed copy of a will. An old will. Not the current one. Not the revised will Mr. Halloran had drafted 3 years earlier, in that same September, alongside the deed and the power of attorney. The original one, from years before my mother got sick, before she'd apparently watched whatever it was she'd watched happen once before, closely enough to change her entire estate plan because of it. I drove to the house that evening with 3 documents in a manila folder: the recorded deed, a certified copy stamped by the county that same day, and a letter from Mr. Halloran's office confirming that the will Renee had shown Sandra Krieg had been legally superseded 2 years and 11 months earlier. Renee opened the door already mid-sentence about something entirely unrelated, already annoyed at being interrupted in her own kitchen, and I set the folder down on the counter. The same counter where our mother used to count out ice cream quarters without saying a single word. I let her open it herself. I watched her read the recording date. I watched her count backward in her head the way you do when a number refuses to match the story you've spent days telling yourself, and I watched the exact moment the math simply failed her. "This isn't right," she said, her voice thinner than I'd ever heard it. "Mom would have told me." I told her, then, the one truth I had promised never to speak while our mother was alive. "She didn't tell you because she knew exactly what you'd do with whatever time she had left, and she was right, because you're doing it now, 4 days after her funeral." Renee didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She looked at me the way you look at an auditor who has just found the one number you were quietly hoping nobody would ever bother to check. And she said the sentence, I know I will remember for the rest of my life. "You always did think you were better than me because you did what she asked and I didn't." I said nothing back. There was nothing left to argue. A deed isn't an opinion, and it isn't a feeling from when you were 12 years old. It's a document, recorded in public record, 3 years before either of us knew we would ever need it to matter. 2 days later, the locksmith came back, this time on an invoice I paid myself, and changed the locks for a second time in 11 days. The moving truck was back in the driveway by the following Saturday morning. The same truck, the same 2 movers, this time carrying that same leather sofa in the opposite direction. Renee left without a note. She left without a single word to me directly, though she did send one final message to the family group chat, the same group chat that had received the photo of the porch 11 days earlier, announcing that she was stepping back from a toxic situation and would be taking space from certain people for a while. 3 cousins responded with heart emojis before anyone had bothered to ask a single clarifying question. Our Uncle Ray called me 2 days later wanting to know both sides, and I told him there weren't 2 sides to a recorded deed, only one side and a story someone had told themselves hard enough to almost believe it. I sent him a copy of the document. He never brought it up again. I hired Mr. Halloran one final time to draft a formal letter confirming the boundaries of the estate, closing the matter cleanly enough that no one could reopen it with another old will pulled from a drawer somewhere. It cost $800, the last expense I will ever spend on my sister's version of our mother's wishes. I have not spoken to Renee in 7 months. She did not come to Thanksgiving. She did not come to what would have been our mother's 67th birthday, the day I planted a 3rd rose bush in the side yard, the same variety our mother always grew, because leaving that spot with only 2 bushes felt like an unfinished sentence I couldn't stand to look at every morning. I still live at 214 Birchwood Lane. I water 3 rose bushes now instead of 2, planted the spring my father left, back when I was 9 and still counting Halloween candy 3 times just to be sure. I haven't spoken to my sister in 7 months, and I've stopped pretending that's the same as peace. There's no clean ending here. Nobody hugged it out on that lawn. She packed a truck and drove away, and the last thing she said to me was an accusation, not a goodbye. This career taught me one thing that never changes. A summary tells you whatever a person needs you to believe. Only the source document tells you what happened. My mother didn't leave a feeling behind, or an old will nobody updated. She left a deed, recorded 3 years early, because she'd watched once before what grief does to people who believe they're owed something the paperwork was never going to give them. If someone in your life is telling you what they're entitled to, go find the actual document. It's almost always sitting quietly in a filing cabinet, waiting for someone patient enough to read it. Has your own family ever rewritten what really happened once nobody was left to correct them? Tell me in the comments and where you're watching from tonight. If this stayed with you, hit like, subscribe if you're new here, and share it with someone who needs to hear the paper trail always wins.